In these images, we are seeing in a raw and clear manner the reaction of a people who are completely fed up with the tyrant. The elections in Venezuela have been a fraud. First, because they were a complete rigging, a daylight robbery, and second, because of the enormous and exaggerated expectations that had been created around these elections. Of course, the dictatorship behaved just as we can expect a dictatorship to behave. It completely ignored the votes, the ballot boxes, and the popular clamor. Thus, the National Electoral Council of Venezuela proclaimed Nicolas Maduro Morris as the winner, despite having, according to known records and electoral surveys, barely 30% of the votes. In our latest video here on VisualPolitik, we explained why it was the Bolivarian government itself that wanted to organize these elections. We explained what they are pursuing and what their objectives are, which, friends, could be the worst news in the world. They devised a plan, executed it, and got away with it. Now then, wait a minute. Does this mean that all is lost? Well, no. There is still a chance. Now that I think it's very clear to all of us that it is the streets and not the votes that can bring freedom to Venezuela, there is a window of opportunity. Insurrection, civil disobedience, and peaceful resistance. To succeed, it is essential to seize this moment before the world soon starts to look the other way. Because of course, this is the same old story. I hate to say it, but let's be honest. In a few hours, Elon Musk and company are likely to get tired of attacking Maduro and shift their attention elsewhere. If you like movies, there's a brutal scene in Hotel Rwanda where one of the characters wonders, how can people not intervene when they witness such atrocities? I think if people see this footage, they will say, oh my god, it's horrible, and then they will go on eating their dinners. And look, this is not a criticism. These are the rules of the game. If Venezuelans really want to have a chance, this is probably the moment. What they don't do themselves, others are unlikely to do for them. The good news is that they are already doing it. Dear friends of VisualPolitik, after the announcement of fraud, Venezuelans have massively taken to the streets. Images of protests are coming in from all over the country, from Zulia to Bolivar, passing through Valencia, Miranda, Aragua, La Guera, and of course, Caracas, which by far is where these protests are most active. The world is watching, and now the Venezuelans can capture its attention. And not only that, although in the first 24 hours after the elections, Chavista repression has already claimed numerous lives, they are still holding back. Among other things, because as I said, the world is watching. And that is why this is probably the best and perhaps the only opportunity. Because friends, enough is enough. Let's stop deceiving ourselves. With Maduro, the ballot boxes are useless. There is no international agreement we can trust, and the possibility of foreign intervention, I'm sorry to say, seems remote. If Venezuela has voted, it is because Maduro wanted it to. That's why it is time to completely change the mindset. Venezuelans can take to the streets, paralyze the cities and towns, and implore the military and security forces to disobey the tyrant. If the regime's pawns start to see their positions at risk, that is when the king will really be in danger. They can call for international help so that the world does more than just lament to the tune of the terrible videos coming from this beautiful country hijacked by criminals of all kinds. And mind you, it's not just about protesting. There is also a need to organize and plan a completely different mode of resistance from this point onward. We are talking about civil disobedience. They must ignore the Bolivarian institutions, point out neighbors who participate in them, create alternative systems of organization in neighborhoods, towns, and cities, strike, recognize different leadership, use the crowd to protect collective security, not contribute economically to the government. Again, go for the pawns instead of the big figures on the board. There are many ways to do it. It's not easy, but the truth, it doesn't seem like there is another path other than insurrection, disobedience, and resistance. Of course, there are risks. We will see them in this video, and perhaps the chances of this plan succeeding are not very high. But I insist, it is perhaps the only really viable plan that exists. However, the gatherings and protests must be peaceful, and above all, massive. We must not fall into provocations. The world is watching, and the tyrant will think twice before moving his pieces. Now then, what exactly is happening in Venezuela? Can disobedience and peaceful resistance really achieve anything? To what extent can the military turn against the Bolivarian revolution? Well, dear friends, that is exactly what we're going to see in this video. Pay close attention, because although the odds are not very high, perhaps very low, here might lie the only engine of change. Venezuelans have taken to the streets en masse. They are protesting, shouting, confronting Maduro's colectivos, and even toppling statues of the grand architect of this entire nefarious system. I am, of course, talking about Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. Friends, we are not talking about isolated cases. Protests are happening all over the country. Roads and highways are even being blocked.
The popular neighborhoods of Venezuela are rising up against Nicolas Maduro in a spontaneous demonstration following the fraud.
And this is happening even in Chavista strongholds like Petare, considered one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in all of Latin America. The problem is that this is not the first time it has happened. For example, these images correspond to the protests of 2017. That year, between April and July, the country was the scene of numerous massive demonstrations. At that time, Venezuelans were protesting energetically against another institutional coup perpetrated by the Chavistas, the Supreme Court's decision to strip the opposition-controlled National Assembly of its functions, a genuine coup d'etat. Since Maduro and his associates had lost the legislative elections, despite all their tricks, they decided to create a new parliament and strip the previous one of its functions. I insist, a full-blown coup d'etat. Venezuelans took to the streets. In the end, the regime's repression left dozens dead and thousands injured and detained. Nothing changed. Later, at the beginning of 2019, after Nicolas Maduro assumed a second term considered illegitimate by most, the president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, proclaimed himself interim president of Venezuela. He did so with the backing of numerous countries, including the United States. This move also triggered many protests for and against Maduro's government. And, as in 2017, the demonstrations were repressed by the government with violence, threats, and detentions. Nothing changed. In 2020 and 2021, the poor economic situation again caused Venezuelans to take to the streets. That didn't work either. These are just some of the instances that have caused the streets of Venezuela to erupt over the years. Now the same thing has happened again, and that is why this time has to be different. The Maduro regime organized the elections and had months to prepare, so we cannot fool ourselves. That the fraud would lead to large public protests was quite predictable. Basically, it's what has happened so far. And precisely for this reason, we must stop following the Bolivarian government's plan. To strike the regime, we must protest, yes, but above all, we must mobilize, establish a different social order, recognize the opposition's authority, organize popular assemblies, point out Chavistas on the streets, and disobey this, excuse me, damned government. And along with all this, we must try to win the support of the police and military. We need to ensure that once and for all they stop looking the other way, or worse, openly collaborating to keep this abject regime standing. By the way, in this regard, the call made by Maria Corina Machado for families to take to the streets to create a genuine civic movement now seems quite accurate. In other words, as can be seen, protests in Venezuela are not something new. So for things to work this time, it is necessary to go a step further. Power in the streets must be completely stripped from Maduro, Cabello, Rodriguez, and company. It is crucial to ensure that this time the outcome of the protests is very different. But of course the question is, can civil disobedience, resistance, and insurrection really work? Well friends, history tells us that it can. It's not easy, but the opportunity exists. Want some examples? Look at these. In 1905, the Finns achieved relative independence from Tsarist Russia after carrying out a massive and prolonged general strike and non-violent actions of non-cooperation. In 1940, Gandhi's campaign used this strategy against the British Empire to achieve independence for India and Pakistan. In 1955, Martin Luther King launched a campaign in the United States against racial segregation. He resorted to boycotts, protests, sit-ins, marches, and strikes. It worked. In 1974, the Portuguese military and people rose peacefully against the Salazar dictatorship in the so-called Carnation Revolution. In 1980, Lech Walesa, together with the Solidarity Union, launched a strategy of protests, civil disobedience, strikes, and civic rebellion in Poland that eventually brought down communism. In the early 1990s, the Baltic republics also achieved their independence through these methods. And friends, we can find many more examples. But let's return to Venezuela. These examples can serve as guidelines for establishing a potentially effective roadmap from now on. In this same vein, the fact that many governments throughout Latin America are completely breaking off relations with the Bolivarian Republic is good news. The more isolated they are, the better. But let's be honest, we're not talking about a strategy without risks. quite the opposite. The narco regime will defend its power tooth and nail. And do you know what? It's already doing so.
The Bolivarian Shield.
Let's not kid ourselves. These protests were predictable. They didn't catch the Chavistas by surprise. The Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino, made it very clear to us on election day.
No queremos que incautos por allí comiencen a hacer el papel de tontos útiles para perturbar la paz de este país. Pero nosotros, repito, vamos a garantizar la paz en la República Bolivariana de Venezuela.
Of course, you can already imagine what guaranteeing peace means. Beatings, gunshots, and tear gas everywhere. The Chavistas knew that inflating the electoral balloon and suddenly popping it would provoke exactly this situation. First, there was shock and denial. The records are on our side. Rule of law in a dictatorship? As if that mattered. Now we are in the midst of a phase of rage and anger. It was a force that had to escape somehow. Now we must avoid what has happened before and what Maduro and company want to happen again this time. That the rage turns into depression and finally acceptance. Anyway, little by little, the Bolivarian government has begun to do what it does best, repress the cries of freedom. This is the first major risk, that Maduro and his associates once again managed to crush the Venezuelans with an iron fist, taking many lives along the way, which, by the way, unfortunately, is already happening.
At least 7 people have been killed in Venezuela due to Chavista repression during a day of protest that saw the destruction of 6 Hugo Chavez statues. Paramilitaries fired shots, beat and intimidated protesters, injuring several young people as well.
And note that the real number seems to be around 15 fatalities in the first 24 hours alone. Unfortunately, by the time you're watching this video, there are surely several more. Additionally, Venezuela's Attorney General Tarek William Saab, yet another Chavista agent, has opened proceedings against Maria Corina Machado for an alleged hacking incident on election night.
Según la información que este Ministerio Público ha recabado, el ataque habría sido realizado desde Macedonia del Norte y habría tenido la intención de manipular los datos que se estaban recibiendo en el CNE. Y obviamente está involucrada la señora María Corina Machado.
As you can imagine, they are also taking note of the names of many of the protesters who have taken to the streets. In other words, besides beating and repressing people in the streets, the regime is also threatening what might happen the next day if they remain in power and the plan doesn't work. The goal, of course, is to generate enough fear to demobilize the Venezuelans. This is another risk. If Maduro and his associates remain in power, the revenge will eventually fall upon many Venezuelans. In fact, if the opposition does not succeed, Maduro and his associates are very likely to try to use this uprising to eliminate many heads inside and outside the regime. This would solidify their power for a long time. It is something they have done in the past, but there is an even greater risk, and it has to do with the military, the police, and the breakdown of command. You see, Chavismo has been very careful to ensure that no one has enough power to overshadow them. The Venezuelan army, for example, has more generals than the United States. Why? Because this way, they have fragmented the command structure significantly. Below the Chavista leadership, no one has enough command to be a threat. In other words, if the army suddenly mutinied against the government, it might only be a part of it, which could lead to direct confrontation between military units. In such a case, it could even result in a civil war. I'm not saying it's likely, but this is one of the mechanisms put in place by Chavismo to protect itself. Don't forget that Hugo Chavez Frias was a military man and knew very well how to keep the uniformed forces under control by buying them off, involving them in shady businesses, and also by atomizing the command structure. This is another risk. And that's not all. To top it off, the Bolivarian regime still has another card to play. Venezuela is devastated. 85% of the people are poor, and 1 in 2 Venezuelans suffer from extreme poverty, and yet despite everything, support for the regime still exceeds 30% of the population, which electorally is not much, but as a shock force, it is significant. And the question is, how on earth is this possible? The answer lies basically in the social programs and money distributed by the government. Venezuela has essentially become a poor exporter of raw materials and illegal substances. Oil, gold, and drug trafficking are its main exports to the world. And all these businesses are basically controlled by the government and its cronies. And what do they use the money from all these activities for? Basically for 3 things: to enrich themselves, to finance their repressive bodies, and to buy loyalties. A very significant part of Venezuelan society still lives off the revolution, and this continues to be a huge source of human resources. In other words, loyalists whose stomachs are still being fed. But then, does this mean that we have to be pessimistic? Not at all. If history tells us anything, it's that when tyrants lose control, their regime tends to dissolve like sugar in water. It's something that happened even in the Soviet Union. It's not easy for them to lose control, but when they do, everything falls apart much faster than one might think. It's true though that Venezuela has an added problem. In this case, we are not talking about a normal government, but a criminal government linked to drug trafficking, smuggling, and 1,001 other crimes. That is, we are dealing with real organized groups like the infamous cartel of the Suns, which operates within the army itself. But let's not end on that note. Friends, let's try to be optimistic. At least there is a precedent. In 1957, the Venezuelan dictator Marcos Perez Jimenez, like Maduro, wanted to stay in power at all costs. 39 days later, in the face of popular clamor, the dictatorship fell. It's true that Venezuela back then was completely different, but it's something. Regardless, one thing is clear. These hours are vital. Honestly, we can't say that we are particularly optimistic at this moment, but we also can't ignore that the window of opportunity exists. It's real. All we can do now is send all our support and strength to the Venezuelans who are in the streets. At VisualPolitik, we have been denouncing the abuses, crimes, and outrages of Maduro since the very moment this channel was born. And do you know what? We are not going to stop. But now, the question is for you. What do you think will happen in Venezuela? What would you do to bring down the tyrant? Leave us your thoughts in the comments, and let's open the debate. Thank you so very much for being here. All the best. See you next time.